Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Dan from Fitness Pain Free, coming at you with a new webinar today. I'm super pumped about. I had a couple people that wanted to know a little bit more about the programming that I do, both from an injury prevention standpoint and also from a rehab perspective. And I went ahead and kind of went a step above that. I think that in general, there are a few training principles that are probably going to help you out more than just programming, because you may have the smartest training program in the world, but if you're not following it appropriately, if you don't have these training principles in place, then you're still going to likely open yourself up to injury. So I name this, it's got a big name to it: How to Avoid Injury and Train Pain Free for the Rest of Your Life, the 6-step checklist. And I just firmly believe that these principles are going to be some of the most important things as far as your own training goes, not only for performance, but also to stay pain free, injury free for the rest of your life. I firmly believe that. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first one that I want to talk about is knowing your own or your client's goals, right? If you're an athlete and you're listening to this, I want to make sure that I'm giving you this information. But if you're a coach or you're a physical therapist, then you also need this information. You need to be able to convey this to the person you're working with. So this is one of the things I ask at every single evaluation I do, whether that's more for strength conditioning, trying to work with a competitive athlete from a performance perspective, or from a physical therapy perspective where I'm working for an athlete that has pain. All right. And it's going to be completely different if you have, let's say, a CrossFit Games champion in front of you versus average Joe or Jane that just wants to get a little bit more fit. All right. And you need to make sure that you know this, because what you do from a training perspective and coaching perspective is going to be completely different. All right. So right now, the CrossFit Regional is just finished up, and I'm working with a variety of games level athletes. And the way I work with these guys is completely different than the way I would work with an average Joe or even a regionals athlete. And I'll show you why in a second. So for these guys, they're still in season, right? They just finished up the regionals, and they have, at this point, 10 weeks or so until the games start. And a lot of these guys are in pain. They've got some active injuries. They're trying to deal with some tweaks. And we're basically trying to keep the ship from falling apart, right? I can't make major changes to their training. I can't tell them, hey, you need to stop squatting, you need to stop doing pull-ups or whatever else it is, because they need to continue doing that so that they can compete and do well. Obviously, if I believe if they continue doing a specific movement, it's going to hurt them further, I'm going to tell them they need to stop, at least for a little bit. But the way I treat that athlete is going to be completely different. On the flip side of the coin, I've had some regionals athletes that regionals just finished up and they didn't do as well as they would have liked to. So now they're in their off season, right? So one athlete that in particular I'm thinking about, she has some wrist pain, she has some hip pain, and she has some elbow injuries. So we can very easily say, hey, look, this is your off season. In your off season, there are a variety of things we want to accomplish. Obviously, you just finished up with your season. You're excited to work on your weaknesses. However, the off season, one of the most important things you can do is stay away from movements for a bit that cause pain, so that you can be fresh leading up into the preseason season, right? Because if we don't unload specific joints or areas, at least for the time being, then they're probably going to continue being a nagging problem that continues chasing you throughout the rest of the season. So the way I'm going to approach that games level athlete is different from the regionals level athlete. Now, when it comes to the average Joe or Jane, that's also completely different, right? These guys don't want to get to the CrossFit Games. They don't care if they can power clean 225. They don't care if they're snatching, I'll make up a specific number, 135, whatever it is. They don't care about that. If they're having pain, right, and they're trying to push these movements, it's pretty easy to just explain to them, like, hey, look, what you're doing in the gym does not match your goals. If you want to be competitive, great, that's fine. You're telling me you're not competitive. Why are we pushing these things right now, right? And once you start to explain these things to your clients, they start to get it. They start to see it from a different perspective. And then from a long-term vantage point, they're more likely to buy into what you want to tell them from a training perspective, so that they get better rehab, and they also pursue their goals in a safer way, right? The other thing is that your coaching changes quite a bit. You can't coach everyone the same exact way, right? So let's say that I have a high-level athlete, and it's a very important workout. I'm going to yell at them. I'm going to say, hey, you need to push harder. You need to make sure you're hitting this split. This specific time needs to get done faster, right? But a lot of times you're working with an average Joe, and they're pushing too hard, right? You can see that they're, looks like they're in another planet. They're about to pass out. Their power cleans look terrible. They're slamming their clavicle with every single rep, right? Their back starts around. I need to tell that person to slow down. This guy doesn't care about competing at a high level, and he's obviously breaking down, and there's a chance that he's going to hurt himself. So I have to coach that person a bit differently, right? So the first thing when you're trying to help someone is you have to know their goals. And then you can modify everything you do from a coaching perspective, rehab perspective, whatever it is, based on what they want to try to achieve. Okay. The next principle we have is that technique is king. All right. And this goes for every set, every rep, all of the time. All right. And I think a lot of times what this comes down to is finding really good coaches. And this is tough to do because you're going to have a coach that's really, really good from a performance perspective, but also from an injury prevention standpoint, right? You may have a coach that's coached a lot of people to an Olympic level, right? Very good coaches, but they have no idea when they're potentially creating problems from an injury standpoint. And that's not good because you want to make sure that you're progressing, but in a safe way. One of the best ways to get worse at your sport is to get hurt. I talk about this all the time. So if you want to progress and you want to get better, if you're getting hurt, you're not doing that. So we just need to make sure that when we're coaching our athletes, we're getting them better, we're not getting them worse, right? And that's tough to find. It's very easy to use more weight and let your technique slack just so you can have a bit more weight on the bar and say you did a specific weight. Now, we know that the worse your technique is, right, the less likely you are to lift more weight. So this dichotomy exists where people are constantly putting more weight on the bar because they want to lift more weight, but their technique just falls apart, right? You just need to be just completely, you need to really be strict on yourself to ensure that every rep looks perfect because we know that that's going to increase your performance, but also decrease your risk of injury. So you really have to check your ego at the door every time you train and make sure that you're having optimal performance, optimal technique, right? The other thing is that we have to know the common faults that lead to injury, right? And having worked with a lot of CrossFit athletes and reading medical literature and asking other smart coaches from the field, we have an idea of common things that do lead to injury. As far as shoulder injuries go, a lot of times with kipping pull-ups, people bottom out their pull-ups. Over time, that can lead to some problems in the shoulder. When people deadlift or Olympic lift, if they round their low back, there's quite a bit of research to show that loaded in a rounded position stresses the discs in the back, which could lead to problems, disc herniations, whatever it is over time. The opposite occurs if we hyperextend the low back with a press or kip or something along those lines, or even with some of our deadlifting clean motions, and when we catch power clean and squat, that can lead to problems in the hips, that can lead to problems in the spine, low back pain, and we need to be able to spot these things as a coach. The other thing is that if we have our scapula anteriorly tip, if our shoulders come forward a lot when we're doing dips or push-ups, that's another thing that can predispose us to injury. So you need to have a coach, or you need to be able to coach yourself really well about these basic things and know when your movement looks poor, so you can perform well, but also so you don't get hurt. And Coach Ryan DeBell, Dr. Ryan DeBell at MoveandFix.com, myself, we made a product called the Coach's Guide to Modifying Workouts for Athletes in Pain. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but what we didn't see in our community, in the CrossFit community, was some sort of guide or a course that you can take that shows these common mechanisms of injury and how to systematically avoid them with your programming and your modifications. And we created exactly that. So I try not to make these things super salesy, but if you're looking to learn more about that, we have a product for you. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit later. All right, so this slide, the thing that I really wanted to get across is that Olympic lifts, power lifts, double unders, muscle ups, kipping, I just picked a whole bunch of movements that we generally see in the gym. They're all skills. I think sometimes we forget that, right? There's people that train their entire life to try to master Olympic lifts, to try to master power lifts, to try to master some of the gymnastics movements, right? Here we are trying to get better at all of these skills all at once and do it in a conditioning environment a lot of times, all right? And we just need to make sure that we treat these movements as skills. We're trying to get better actively at the movement every single time we do it, right? That's super important. And we often treat these as conditioning tools when it's not appropriate, right? Let's say we have Sally. Sally cannot do a power clean to save her life, right? And we're in the strength portion of our group training class, and we're working power cleans, and we're really trying to get her elbows up faster. She's just having a tough time every single time that bar crashes on her clavicles, right? And we know this is not optimal technique, but we're working on it, and we're doing it in a skill environment, then that's the time to do it. Now, afterwards, our conditioning actually calls for some power cleans in the workout, you know? And if Sally couldn't do these things when she's fresh with an appropriate load and great coaching, there's no way she's going to do it while she's tired, right? So we need to know how to modify these people. Let's make sure that we're giving them something that accomplishes the goal. We want to try to condition our bodies. Maybe we're focusing on the posterior chain. We want a movement that mimics that. We could very easily throw a swing in there, right? If someone can't do double unders and their entire conditioning workout is going to be messed up because they hit this roadblock or the double unders pop up and they keep on messing up the skill and they can't string them together and they're frustrated and their heart rate's not where it needs to be, then let's substitute it. Let's get some single unders, right? Let's do easier variations that allow us to maintain good technique and not get hurt over time and still get the training effect we desire. Okay, so the next principle we want to talk about is listening to your body. Now, this is pretty much common sense, but I feel like it's something we don't do enough of. It's very important. Your body's constantly giving you a little bit of feedback about when you can push, when you need to back off, and so on and so forth. Sometimes I say it's kind of like a professor. It's just going to give you feedback about how hard you should be training, right? One of my favorite coaches is Jason Leiden. He's a coach for CrossFit Milford, which is the team has been to the game several times. They were second in 2015, and he has lots of masters and regular individual athletes that have gone to the games as well. But he talks about the amount of stress that your body can handle, kind of like a bank account with a set amount of funds, right? So let's say that in your bank account you get $1,000 every single day to spend. And then when you go to sleep, you wake up, the next day it's back to 1,000 again. All right? Everything that you do is like withdrawing from your bank account. So let's say work is tough, takes away $500 from your bank account. Let's say you get in a couple arguments with your boss or maybe with your wife or husband, whatever it is, and you withdraw another $200, right? Then you have extra responsibilities. You have to go grocery shopping, right? You have to do all types of whatever it is. Maybe let's say it's another $300. Now you have $0 left at the end of the day to train, all right? Because training is stressful as well. So it's important when you're trying to manage your stress without your daily life, you're taking into account all the things in your body that are going to stress you. And if you do too much at any given time, you start to withdraw and overdraw, right? So you go beyond what you actually have. And at that point, a lot of times your training suffers and you get worse, right? So as far as stress goes, how can you tell if you're stressed out? Well, I think for a lot of people it's pretty obvious, but in a lot of ways we can think about mood, right? So a lot of times when we're stressed out, our mood starts to get terrible or easily irritable, right? For me, my ability to think goes down. It sounds kind of crazy, but when I'm trying to explain things to patients, I have trouble finding words. My memory starts to go away. It's not so great. The other thing that happens a lot of times is that when you're really stressed out, your ability to handle stressful situations gets worse, right? Something stressful happens at work and you're supposed to stay calm and be able to react in a peaceful way, and sometimes you can't, so that's a way to tell if your body's saying like, hey, you're really stressed out. The importance of this is knowing that if you have this stress going on in your life, your training should reflect this, right? So if you've already withdrawn, let's say $900 from your bank account that has $1,000, you only have $100 left, and you can't spend $200 without overdrafting. Just keep in mind, when you overdraft, things start going badly, and your risk of injury goes up as well. Right? So next two things are sleep and nutrition. So these are the things that help to refill your bank account. Right? Let's say that every single day you get $1,000 into your bank account just from sleeping. Let's say one night you only sleep 5 hours. Right? So let's say you only refilled $800 into your bank account. Right, and your normal day takes 1,000 with all the stress you have. At this point, you're running low, right? You don't have the opportunity to train as hard as you normally would. The other thing that helps is nutrition. Nutrition also helps refill that bank account. Are you getting enough calories? Are your calories coming from a good source? Are you missing meals, right? If you're not doing these things properly, you're not going to get your $1,000 back to spend for the entire day, right? Another major concept that I talk about a lot are these little tweaks that happen, right? You're not necessarily injured, but certain parts of your body are starting to bug you a little bit. Let's say you're warming up and all of a sudden you're like, oh, my knee's a little painful today. It's not feeling great. One of the things you probably shouldn't do are 150 wall balls. Let's say Karen shows up that day and your knee's not feeling great. You probably shouldn't push it too much. Let's say you tweak your neck sleeping, and then the workout for the day has a bunch of swings and push jerks, and you know those movements are generally pretty tough on your neck. Maybe you shouldn't push it too much. So it's important that when you're warming up that day, that'll help to dictate your training. Like, my neck was bugging me a little bit, but the warm-ups all feel great. My body's feeling really good, and I'm ready to roll. And then you go ahead and push it. But let's say you start warming up, like, yeah, this is really bothering my neck. It doesn't feel good. You probably need to make a modification when you train that day. All right. A good example for me, and this kind of goes to the whole stress thing, is that about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I went to Power Monkey Camp. Power Monkey Camp is phenomenal. It's a ton of fun, but it's also you pretty much work from as soon as you wake up to when you go to sleep. A lot of nights I'd be working until 10:30 at night trying to help people out, so it's stressful. And the other thing is that the Wi-Fi wasn't working, so I couldn't do any of my business stuff I needed to get done. So I was getting stressed out because of that. Right? When I'm at Power Monkey Camp, I'm in Tennessee. I'm not able to see patients. So one of the things that happens is that when I come back, I have a ton of patients that need to be seen, which is fine, but it's more stress, right? The other thing is I had to catch up on the work stuff I couldn't do because the Wi-Fi was broken. So I had more patients, right? I also had to catch up with all my business stuff, all my line stuff. The other thing is that one of our coworkers quit, right? He's the one who normally does administration, does all the insurance and billing, and I had to do all that now, right? And then also one of my coworkers, my boss, Lenny, he was out, right? So I'm trying to see his patients. And meanwhile, I'm trying to still train and do everything else myself, and I was getting super beat up. I was freaked out. My mood was terrible. I wasn't able to sleep at night. And what ended up happening is I started to get these little tweaks, right? I was doing swings one day, and my trap and neck started really hurting me. I'm like, this is crazy. This never happens, right? I was doing some sled pushes, and my Achilles was hurting me. I was like, what the heck? What's going on? A couple days later, my shoulder was bothering me. Wasn't feeling good. And the icing on the cake was one of the days during the week I was trying to show someone a lat stretch and just bent forward to show them a lat stretch, and then my back just kind of spasmed up and tightened up, and I couldn't get back up again. And it's I should have known. I had a ton of stuff on my plate, right? I was trying to continue training at the same level that I normally do, and my body just said no, right? So what I do the next few weeks, I made sure I got enough sleep. I didn't take extra responsibilities at work, right? I listened to my body. I modified my training, and I just kind of got back to normal again. And you should think about this when you're training. I probably trained too much when I was this stressed out, and my body told me. So that's what happened. Okay. This is kind of an interesting thing, but I just want you guys to be aware to be careful of high times, right? Every once in a while, people are doing extremely good with their training. They're breaking PRs. They're feeling great. Their training has just been all-time high, and then they get hurt, right? I just want people to be aware that when you're feeling good and things are going well, you still need to follow solid programming principles, okay? Make sure you're getting your deload. Make sure you're caring about your nutrition, rest, all that stuff, because a lot of times you don't feel it until it breaks down. And then you look back on it, you're like, yeah, I've been training at a breakneck pace and things have been going really well, so I've been continuing to push. I've been kind of riding that high, and then you get hurt. So you got to be really careful of that as well. So when you're feeling really, really good and you're doing extremely well, you have to be careful just as well as, when you're feeling terrible and your body's all beat up, right? So on a regular basis, ask yourself, how's your body feeling? You feeling a little beat up? Your joints a little bit painful, right? Are you tired? You feel like you're beat down by life, a lot of things going on in your personal life, something happening at work that's really getting you down, right? Do you feel energized? Are you excited? Do you feel like you don't need to warm up at all? You just want to tackle the weights with extreme ferocity? If that's the case, then go ahead and push it, all right? But you should base your everyday on how you feel and use that to modify your training. You feel great, do an extra set. You feel bad, drop down a little bit, all right? Just try to take all these things into account when you're training. Okay, so if technique is king, modification is queen, all right? Now, being able to modify movement is absolutely vital. This happens a little bit more in a group training environment. just because in a group training environment, a lot of times you have a specific workout and you're trying to get everyone to be able to do it, and not everyone's at the same level. So a lot of times what ends up happening is some people are getting a workout that's not hard enough, and a lot of people are getting a workout that's too hard. So this is where modification comes into place. The thing is, coaches are going to need, as well as athletes, are going to need really smart progressions and modifications for pretty much every single movement that they're providing their athletes, right? And this is so people continue to progress, but it's also so you don't give someone a movement that's too challenging for them so they break down and get hurt, right? A couple good modification idea for the pull-ups are some kipping pull-up variations that I have. I can provide the videos and the footnotes for this webinar, but if you're unable to kip well, then, or do a kipping pull-up well, you can break that down to just regular kipping. You can kip with a quarter pull. You can kip with a half pull. You can also self-spot with your feet. So all these modifications work out really well so that you have athletes that are able to get a good workout, to get the same training effect without the extra stress on whatever body part, right? Same thing goes for something like a handstand push-up. That's a challenging exercise. For a lot of athletes, it's going to be a piece of cake and it's easy and they're going to blow through a ton of them. For other athletes, it's going to be impossible. So you need to have a series of regressions for this, you know, a regular push-up, maybe a handstand push-up with your knees on the box, a piked handstand push-up, or a pike on the box handstand push-up. All these things are progressively more challenging in nature, so you can meet the needs of every athlete that you're going to be working with. So the next really important thing to talk about as far as modification goes is avoiding training spikes. Now, a couple years ago, a gentleman by the name of Tim Gabbett started to do some research about spikes in training volume, and if the amount of volume of training that you're doing is increasing our risk of injury, decreasing it. Previously, we kind of thought the more you do a given activity, the more likely you are to get hurt just because you're doing it more often. And one of the things that Tim is finding is that exercise in general is protective. So if you have a high level of fitness, that's actually protective. But what does end up giving people injuries is a spike in your training, right? Now, a lot of this I have to take with a grain of salt just because it's mostly in soccer players, mostly in rugby players. They haven't done this in CrossFit athletes or in fitness, but it makes total sense, right? If you're not used to stressing a given body part in a certain way and you haven't done it in a while, if you all of a sudden do that, it's a huge spike in your training. Now, most people get hurt generally when they start a fitness program more towards the beginning of starting, right? I think that's just because your body's just not prepared for it, and it makes total sense, all right? But we can use this information to our advantage when figuring out how hard we should be pushing, right? So a good example is that I personally haven't run in months, right? And now the weather in the Northeast United States is getting a little nicer, and a lot of gyms are, okay, let's go outside, let's do some running. And there was one running workout that was, I don't know what it was, 400, 600, 800, something like that. It was all running. And about halfway through the workout, I tweaked my calf, right? I had a strain injury to my calf. And it makes sense. I haven't ran in months, right? But you'll find this at a lot of gyms. A lot of gyms will it'll be nice outside. People want to start running, so they just start running, you know? And people sometimes get hurt. I mean, that happened to me. And I'm a 31-year-old guy. It's not like I'm in my 50s and 60s and haven't run in a long time and used to run in college and track. So I'm an example of a guy who just hasn't done it in a while, go out there and get hurt, right? So I think it's really important if you're writing programming, right, for your community, for your gym, one of the things you can do in the months before is you can add some more pogo jumps into your warm-ups, more skipping drills, more agility drills. When you start doing running a workout, don't open up with a 400 repeat workout. Open up with maybe like an AMRAP that has a 100-meter run plus 10 pull-ups, 10 push-ups, 10 wall balls, something along those lines. That way the running is not really that challenging, and over time just build up, build up, build up, and then you can do those repeat 400 workouts for your group, right? So I think it comes down to the athlete and the coach to have responsibility. The coach to write the smart program, but the athlete, so like me, I should realize that's probably not a great workout for me because I have a history of tweaking my soleus whenever I try to do these things, right? That really goes for hero WODs. You know, I think hero WODs are amazing, but hero WODs are also very, very tough, right? Tomorrow is Memorial Day in the United States, and a lot of people are doing Murph. And Murph is great. It's a lot of running, it's a lot of pull-ups, a lot of stuff that we're not used to doing on a consistent basis in the gym. So if you're preparing for a hero WOD, you should probably in the weeks leading up to it increase the volume of running, increase the volume of push-ups, increase the volume of squatting, increase the volume of pull-ups in the case of Murph. maybe quarter Murph, half Murph, doing little mini workouts along the way just to get the body prepared for it, right? Slowly increase that pull-up volume, right? Don't get rhabdo. Unfortunately, a lot of my wife's a family physician, and a lot of our friends have learned about CrossFit through Hero WODs because people have gotten rhabdo from doing that, right? So the local family medicine physicians are seeing people get that, and it's unfortunately does happen from time to time, but I think we can do a lot to try to prevent that. Okay. So the next thing when it comes to modifications is that we can really pick modifications that fit your Metcon goals. All right. So here's a good example, and it's a reason why I see people get hurt quite frequently. So let's say you have a workout with kipping pull-ups. We'll pick Fran just because everyone knows what Fran is. It's 21, 15, 9 reps of thrusters and pull-ups, right? And let's say that you just recently were able to string together a few kipping pull-ups. Let's say you can do 2 or 3 in a row without it starting to fall apart and look terrible. All right, and you want to do this workout as prescribed, right? So let's say I try to do the same thing with my 2 to 3 rep max deadlift, right? Let's say I can deadlift 500 for 2 to 3 reps, right? Now, would you go into a workout and try to pull 45 reps at a 500-pound deadlift? No, that's a surefire way to get hurt. But it's the same thing with kipping pull-ups. Let's say if you can only do 2 to 3 max kipping pull-ups, a good technique, and they start falling apart. That's the same as me trying to pick a 2 to 3 rep max deadlift and try to do that for 45 reps in a workout. You just wouldn't do it. However, you see that quite a bit at different gyms. So we want to make sure that the exercise is going to fit the conditioning goal of the workout. For something like Fran, it's probably going to be a 5 to 7 minute workout or lower, right? But if your rep max and kipping pull-ups is 2 or 3, it's going to take forever. You're not getting that training effect that we want, all right? So we need to change it somehow. So you can modify this. Let's say I just came up with something on the fly. Let's say instead of doing Fran, you'll do 10 rounds of 3 pull-ups and 5 thrusters. So it's lower volume in general for the pull-ups. So it's 30 total pull-ups, 50 thrusters, about the same on thrusters. However, you're only doing 3 at a time. So you're not necessarily going to failure and then going back up and going to failure and then getting back up and going to failure. You're relatively fresh each time. You turn back to pull-ups, take a breather, 2 to 3 reps, back over the thrusters, finish up your thrusters, take a few breaths, and back to the pull-ups. Then you're not bottoming out every single pull-up and going to failure every single repetition, which is obviously not good for the joint, right? The other thing we do is we can just substitute a different exercise. So 21, 15, 9 reps of a kipping pull-up might not work out, but something like a ring row might work really well. Or we can substitute an easier kipping variation just like we talked about before. So maybe it's just a regular kip on a bar or a kip with a quarter pull or a half pull. All of a sudden our technique looks really good. We're still getting the training effect desired and people aren't opening up their risk for injury. All right. So let's go to the next one. All right. The next thing, and this is probably one of the most important conversations I have with people once they get hurt, is that everyone is an individual. Now, I like to bring up my good buddy Paul Bono. Paul Bono is a coach at CrossFit Verve, where I used to coach at. Paul Bono is also on CrossFit Team Milford in 2015 when they were number 2 in the games. He's a phenomenal athlete, right? And what I tell people is that Paul Bono modifies every single workout that he does. So he's a mid-20-year-old games athlete, and he modifies every single thing that he does, right? And the reason being is because sometimes things are tweaked, sometimes things hurt, doesn't want to push something. He knows certain exercise, if you do too much of it, it's going to bug him. So he just modifies everything, all right? He's smart enough to know how to get a training effect for himself and also smart enough to know that if he pushes too hard on any given workout, he gets hurt, right? All of his program is written by Jay Leiden, so he's able to take that program and tweak it a bit, all right? So if Paul Bono, games athlete, right, super high-level individual, is modifying every single workout that he does, then how come the average Joes and Janes and everyone else in their gym can't be doing that as well? The answer is there's no reason. Everyone should be doing some sort of modification to fit their own goals, right? That's just common sense. It's just that a lot of people feel like they can't do that if they want to get really good. But that's just not the best mentality, okay? Modify because it's going to help you, all right? The other thing that's really important is that some people won't be able to handle as much volume of certain movements than other people, right? So a good example of that is, I use myself as an example, so I tend not to be able to squat with too much volume, right? So if I'm squatting too many times per week, I start getting knee pain, I start getting hip pain. Those are kind of the areas that start to bug me. For other individuals, if they do too much squatting, their back starts talking to them. Their back starts to bug them a little bit, all right? Some people can do the same squat volume and they'll be A-okay. They can squat all day long and they never have any trouble. All right, so just know that some people are inherently going to be able to handle more volume than others, just based on a variety of factors. But it's going to be different for every single person. We just have to keep that in mind. All right, and as an athlete, if you've been doing this for long enough, you want to look for trends, right? So let's say if you press more than 2 days a week overhead, your shoulder starts to bug you. So you know for yourself, you got to be careful with that volume and how many times per week you're doing it. Like I was saying before, the squatting, the knee pain, that's what I deal with. Sometimes it's squatting, low back pain, all right? It doesn't have to be squatting in general. It could be running, right? For me, running gives me calf strains. I'm not really careful about loading things up carefully, all right? Just to give you a couple more examples for myself, I know my shoulder doesn't really like a lot of ring dips if I do too much volume of it. So what I like to do is in the off season, I do a lot of strict dip work, a lot of tempo work, a lot of pause work, a lot of weighted dip work, and I do this mostly in parallel bars. As we progress throughout the training year, I start incorporating some more ring dips, and then I start incorporating more kipping ring dips, and then I incorporate more muscle up variations, and then by the time the open comes around, my shoulder's feeling pretty good because I had nice progressive load over the course of the year. And then once the volume starts to go up, 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 sometimes my shoulder starts to hurt, sometimes not. And then after the open's over and I don't have to string together a bunch of muscle ups and ring dips anymore, I cut it down again. All right. That way, I never get to the point where my shoulders really bother me. I'm a smart progressive ramp throughout the course of the year, and I shut it down when I need to. All right. Like I said before, squat volume is very important for me. If I squat too much, I get hurt. My technique is very important. If I'm too close, too narrow with my stance, too much knee in, my hip starts to bother me. All right. Too much squat volume, like I said before, is a little bit tough on my knee. I have to be careful with the volume of Olympic lifts, especially cleans. If I'm not doing the clean properly, sometimes I drop it a little too hard on my clavicle, right? Just that front rack position on its own can be a little tough on my shoulders, so I have to be careful with how many times throughout the week I'm in that front rack position. And as I talked about before, my running has to be a slow, gradual ramp up, otherwise my calves start to give me trouble. It makes me sound like I'm super frail, but in general, this is how we have to start thinking if you're an athlete and you want to be an athlete for the rest of your life. All right. So the next is that you really need to do what you have to do to stay healthy and using the information we just talked about. So for me, right? So I know that if I squat too many times throughout the week, I can get hurt, right? So what do I need to do? I need to reduce the sets, reduce the reps, reduce the frequency throughout the course of the week. Maybe for some people, it's the load. They know that, when I load my deadlift to maximal weights, that's generally when I break down. Okay, for you, we need to be careful with that. Maybe we can do more sets at a lighter load with more tempo work, whatever it is. Maybe we need to modify the deadlift variation more frequently and just hit on that really heavy deadlift only from time to time so we stay healthy. All right? You don't want to blindly do what's written on the board. You have to keep into consideration your training from months and years past and come up with the best plan for you. All right? So some other things to take into consideration are your age, right? Obviously, this makes sense. If I'm 40 to 50 years old, I've had time to build up a whole bunch of injuries, right, that I have to be cognizant about, all right? And that's what I mean by that injury history. The other thing we talked about quite a bit before is the level of stress in your life. If you're super stressed out, you probably aren't going to be able to handle as much, all right? If you're very low stress level, then you can handle more, all right? Makes sense. The other is past failures and trends. We just spoke about this a little bit more. If you constantly notice, the other day I had a patient, she's like, every time the open comes up, my low back goes out on me again, time after time, every year, right? Well, that's a trend. There's something about what happens in that period of time when you ramp up from your off season to preseason that ends up bugging your back. And we have to take a look at that and figure out why that's happening and then try to correct it, right? Obviously, we don't want to keep on repeating the same mistakes. And then also sleep hygiene and nutrition. We made that analogy the other day of the bank account. The way we refill our money from a day-to-day basis is by having great sleep, having great nutrition, all right? And then the next day, we have a good amount of energy to spend with all the things that stress us in our life, right? Another very important thing to have is a realistic expectation of what your body can handle. And I'm just going to give you a couple of my previous patients I wanted to talk about because I think that kind of highlights the point quite a bit. So the first patient is a patient with a patellar tendon tear. And this gentleman, unfortunately, was having quite a bit of pain, kind of presents like a patellar tendinopathy. Went to the doctor. Lo and behold, he had a small tear of his patellar tendon. Not super common. I don't see that a ton. But anyway, he was actually being treated by another therapist at our facility for about 7 months. And he's just really frustrated because it wasn't making the progress that he really wanted to, right? And he was considering surgery. He was considering like a PRP injection, all this extra stuff, you know. And I got a chance to talk to him, and just from talking to him for a while, his ideal and what he wanted to get back to was very high volume Olympic weightlifting plus CrossFit on top of that. So basically, Olympic lifting 6 days per week, and also doing CrossFit training with gymnastics training on top of that 6 days a week. He wanted to train pretty much like a CrossFit Games athlete, all right? And you know, one of the things I'm thinking is that you know he's not going to be happy unless he's able to accomplish this. So every time he tries to get back to this higher level of training, he just kind of gets hurt again, right? So besides rehabbing him and giving him a nice progressive training program, we talked a ton about expectations. We're like, look, dude, you want your knee to feel 100% all the time and never feel any pain, but you want to do this crazy amount of volume with your Olympic lifting and your CrossFit. It doesn't make a ton of sense, right? You're going to have a sore knee, right? Not everyone can handle super high volume of Olympic lifting and CrossFit. It's too much for a lot of people, right? A lot of people at the games level can't handle this, right? It's just too much. And we had to really manage his expectations, just let him know, because he just felt like a failure every time he tried to go back and his knees started to bug him again. And it wasn't really the case. He's just a normal human being. He's just going through the process of trying to compete at a super high level. And then just giving him those expectations just made him feel a little bit more at peace and more realistic about his progress, and made the whole process a bit easier, right? And the other patient I have, and this goes back to a bit of the stress that we were talking about before, is a patient who came to me for chronic cervicogenic headaches. He had previously had a bicep rupture and Achilles tendon rupture, and this all happened within the span of like a year and a half, right? He's 40 years old, so he's not necessarily a spring chicken anymore, and he's got a very high stress job. And in prior years, he's pretty much kind of trained like a madman. He wasn't necessarily just a CrossFit guy, but he loved lifting heavy. He spent hours in the gym every day. He loves to do lots of conditioning, loves to do a lot of sprinting, had some big goals as far as how fast he'd like to be able to run, which is all awesome stuff. It's really good. But I think this is just a good example of a guy that was burned the candle from two ends for too long, and his body is just saying no, right? So, yeah, multiple tendon ruptures, which honestly doesn't really happen a ton unless you're on drugs. And I don't think that he was on drugs. So he ruptures bicep, ruptures Achilles tendon, and was having a ton of headaches and lots of neck issues, right? And he wasn't training at all, and he was super duper frustrated, you know. And we just had to talk about his expectations. Like, look, man, you know, you've been hitting it hard for several years, right? And you've got a lot of chronic problems that you're trying to rehab back, and you're trying to get back to a level of training that might be a little bit too much, right? So this is an uphill battle, and it's going to take a long time, months, even years, right? So every time he came back in, it's like, you know, I'm still having headaches, still having problems, and if I just listened to what he said every time he came in, I'd feel like a complete failure. But in all reality, he came in, he wasn't training at all, and now he's back to some Olympic weightlifting, doing kettlebell swings, he's squatting, he's deadlifting, he's doing all that stuff, and he's getting very little symptoms. And I'm telling you, it's way better than it was at before, and he's still got room to go. But we needed to really manage his expectations and let him know, like, look, this takes time. This is something that's slow, and the amount of stuff that you want to get back to might be too much for you, right? You have to just keep that in mind when you're training and listen to your body, right? So let's move on. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about pain, all right? So one of the major reasons why we modify our movements is because something hurts. And here's what I'll say. Training with pain is like playing with fire, right? Sometimes you get burnt, sometimes you don't, okay? The thing about pain is it's hard to predict when things are going to get better and when it's not. So sometimes your pain gets better if you train through it, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it stays the same, or sometimes it gets worse, right? I think as coaches, it's super important that we try to modify their training as much as we can. And the same goes for therapists, because one of the biggest things, one of the ways that we can get our athletes better is to subtract the movements that they're doing that are causing the pain. And over time, their sensitivity can go down and down and down, and they get better and they get better, right? But if you're an athlete and you keep on blowing through all the movements that give you pain, then you're just going to stay sensitive and painful, all right? Sometimes people get better, but it's just not the best way to go about it, all right? So we need to be great at modifying as coaches so that our athletes can just get better, so we don't keep irritating whatever problems they have. And for the therapist, you're going to keep spinning your wheels, because if you don't know how to modify activities and then also grade and put these activities back into the training program on a graded basis, you're just going to be frustrated because your patients are not going to get better, and they're just going to keep on going through this cycle of get a little bit better, go back to training, get hurt, go back to therapy, get a little bit better, go back to training, get hurt, and we don't want that. We want to make sure we can progress them back nice and easy. All right. And the other thing I like to say is that pain doesn't equal damage, but as a coach, you shouldn't be making your athletes work through pain. I just don't think that that's smart. This is where therapists, they tinker, right? So after you have an injury, the analogy I like to give my patients is that it's kind of like your house has a super sensitive alarm system. So basically, let's say the mailman stops by and drops off your mail, and then just because your alarm system's so sensitive, it goes off, right? So now the alarm system is blaring in your house, blaring, blaring, blaring. But it's not like the mailman broke in and started to steal stuff. He didn't. He just dropped off your mail, all right? So when you have an injury, your alarm systems are higher. Basically, your body's trying to protect you, and he does that through pain, all right? So after we have an injury, initially we need to unload this, okay? So let's say the deadlifts hurt my spine. You got to stop deadlifting for a bit. Let's just make sure that we're unloading that area, all right? Not irritating the system, allowing that sensitivity to go down, okay? The next part is that it's really important that your exercise is going to build capacity. And the thing that I tell people is that, let's say you have an injury to your back and you did deadlifting, all right? And you want your body to heal. The way your body heals is through stress. So we actually have to show our body what it needs to be able to handle. So we can introduce low-level deadlift drills when someone's ready for it. And that's actually going to help people. And from a therapy perspective, we tinker with pain a little bit. Let's say you have a little bit of pain. Let's say it's a 2 out of 10, pain-wise. Now, for me as a therapist, I'm fine with that, right? That's just your alarm system's up a little bit. It just means that you've got a little bit of pain, but at the same time, it's not necessarily causing more damage. We're doing something that's low level, it's easy, it's going to help your body in order to heal and recover. So we need to make sure that we're smart about the way we apply those things. All right. So next is a little bit of a plug that I have. And I apologize again. I don't like to be super salesy, but the thing is, Coach Ryan DeBell, Dr. Ryan DeBell, is a chiropractor out of Washington, Seattle area. Also has a movementfix.com. So we did a seminar one time at a gym in Chicago, and we kind of asked ourselves, what's the most valuable thing we can do to tell coaches what to do? How can we teach them? What's the best thing we can impart? And we kind of thought, well, these coaches are working with people in pain every single day, right? And so do I as a physical therapist, and so does Ryan. We're working with people who have pain. And what's one of the biggest things that coaches need? Well, they need to be able to handle athletes in pain. It's not like they're treating them, but they still have to make sure that they're training and working towards their goals, right? The other thing is, as a coach, we don't want to make our athletes worse, right? So we have this idea of like, okay, well, I want to keep training this person, but I don't know if I'm hurting this person. Am I making them worse? Is it helping them? I have no idea. So we made a product in order to show you how to do this, right? How do you modify the movements that commonly cause pain in order to have people desensitize, get better, and keep progressing towards their goals, right? So we just made it for every single movement. There's a hinge pattern or deadlifting. There's squatting. We go over big time squat, all the joints involved. And when people have pain with those movements, overhead pressing, horizontal pressing, vertical pulling, horizontal pulling. And we just basically gave modifications for everything, just so you can keep on having your athletes progress without getting hurt, all right? I know I spoke before about common mechanisms of injury, like when your back rounds in the deadlift and how that's bad, right? Shoulder blade position, how that's bad, what's potentially happening in your body when we get hurt. And as a coach, what you can do not only to improve technique from a performance perspective, but an injury prevention standpoint, all right? All right, enough of the plug. All right, so our next topic here is for mobility. We want to assess, not guess. So we know that mobility limitations lead to subpar technique and often injury. All right, good example is that if I can't squat to depth, all right, or I can't get my arms overhead very well, I'm going to have a lot of trouble when I try to do something like a snatch. Okay, mobility is the foundation of all movement mastery. So it makes sense. If I want to have great technique, I want to reduce my risk of injury, I need to have good mobility. All right, and you can't coach out of poor mobility. The best coaches in the world can give you all the cues in the world, and it's not going to make a lick of difference unless you get enough mobility in the area where you need it in order to display that with your technique. All right. So I've been lucky enough to work with Power Monkey Fitness for the past 4 years, and they have a host of amazing coaches. So Chad Vaughn, 2-time Olympian. He also teaches the advanced CrossFit weightlifting certification all over the world. Mike Service, 10-time Team USA, does a ton of teaching for Power Monkey Fitness, phenomenal weightlifter and great coach. And also Dave Durante, who's 6-time Team USA, I believe, and was an Olympic alternate for the 2004 Olympic Games in China for gymnastics. Okay. Um, and they all say this all the time, that the primary reason for lack of mastery a lot of times is mobility. So much so that Chad Vaughn, who is supposed to be teaching the advanced CrossFit weightlifting class, spends a lot of time with mobility for the squat, right? And I think the higher ups at CrossFit gave him some trouble before. It was like, hey, Chad, this is supposed to be an advanced class. We're supposed to, be working towards mastery for the Olympic lifts here. And Chad's like, well, the majority of people I'm working with, the reason why they can't lift well is because they're not mobile enough. If we want these people to get better, they need to work on this. So the most advanced class with the most advanced teachers in the world, this guy's still harping on the importance of mobility to master these lifts, right? It's just crazy, crazy important, okay? So I wanted to give you guys a few examples of how mobility is not only going to be something that keeps you from performing well, but it's also going to lead to injury, right? So if someone has limited ankle dorsiflexion, let's say they can't bend well at the ankle and they have shoulder pain in the snatch, and it could be because they just can't stay upright with their torso because of limited ankle dorsiflexion. Because of that, you got to make up that range of motion loss somewhere, and a lot of times that's the shoulder. So all of a sudden our shoulder starts hurting when we're snatching, and it's not a shoulder problem at all. The shoulder's just a victim. It's that limited ankle dorsiflexion. When it comes to CrossFit, generally we're doing lots and lots of shoulder stuff. Okay, the shoulder gets beat up. We don't need to beat it up even more by having poor technique in something like a snatch, right? Another one we see a lot is limited elbow and thoracic spine mobility leading to wrist pain in the front rack, right? Are you that person who does thrusters and catches their cleans and their hands are still up in the air, right? The wrist feels like it's going to explode sometime from all the stress in that area. So if my elbow doesn't bend well, my thoracic spine is stiff, then what's going to happen is my wrist is going to have to make up for that limitation in range of motion. And that mobility problem coming from the thoracic spine and the elbow is leading to wrist pain. And if we could clean that up and get in a better position and rest that bar on the shoulders a little bit more easily and not crank the wrist into hyper dorsiflexion, then we wouldn't have as much problems as far as pain goes. All right. Another pretty common one is limited hip extension and low back pain. Let's say I can't extend well from my hip. There's a ton of hip extension that happens in CrossFit. So Olympic lifts, swinging, running, snatching, everything that has to do with propelling a barbell is going to involve hip extension for the most part. All of our running, all of our jumping, double unders, box jumps, everything requires hip extension. If I'm lacking that motion, I have to make it up somewhere else. And a lot of times that's the low back, so people end up extending more and more from the low back, right? So we get some overuse of that position, plus the low back musculature is called into work even more. So every once in a while we have some people that come apart and come by and they've got limited hip extension. Their low back musculature kind of goes into spasm from time to time. And I think if we can clean up this hip extension and learn to activate the glutes and move more through the hips, we'd have a lot less trouble, right? So just a couple things to think about, how this mobility deficit is going to lead to injury. So, all right. The other thing is that having an adequate assessment, if you're going to take someone through a full assessment and figure out where the limitations are, right, it's going to lead your modifications. So now you'll know how to modify well for that athlete so they don't get hurt, right? Let's go back to that individual that has limited ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, can't bend their ankle. Because of that, they can't stay upright in a squat, right? Now, should I have that athlete do thrusters or overhead squats? Well, we just said if you can't stay upright at all, one of the things that's going to happen is that now the shoulder may be sacrificed a bit in its positioning in order to get that barbell completely overhead, right? So if I can't stay upright at all in a squat, should I overhead squat? Well, to be as safe as possible, probably not, right? Same thing goes for thruster. So if I start dumping forward in the bottom of my front squat, my elbow is going to drop quite a bit, right? The bar is going to start rolling down. It's going to stress the crap out of my wrist, and that's not really a wrist problem like we said before. That's an issue at the ankle. However, if we push these things while we have a mobility limitation, then chances are we're probably going to get hurt, right? So we can easily modify for that athlete. So like, okay, you're not doing overhead squats, say you're doing goblet squats, all right? Or you're not going to be doing a thruster with a barbell today. You're going to be thrusters with dumbbells, right? So it's pretty easy to make that modification if you know what this mobility limitation is and the movements that they can't do. In this case, staying upright in a squat, right? If someone has poor overhead mobility, should we be doing jerk work? Should we be kipping? I don't know. I mean, I think we've all seen it. Someone who has limited overhead motion, when they press a barbell fully overhead and try to lock it out, the rib cage comes up. They've got a lot of extension in the low back. Over time, this can lead to some problems. Same thing happens with a kip. If I'm trying to kip on my backswing as I arch, one thing that's going to happen is I'm going to get too much motion for my lumbar spine, right? I'm not going to be able to create an effective kip because I don't have the range of motion to create momentum and power, right? Even worse, if I have limited range of motion, I'm jamming that shoulder into its end range of mobility, and I might be causing problems just by doing that. So it makes sense. You can modify very easily for these athletes. Stay away from overhead stuff. Stay away from kipping. Give them some more strict work, right? And the last one is, let's say I have poor hip mobility. Should I be squatting deep? Well, I think we've all heard of butt wink. Once you run out of range of motion in the hip, one of the things your body does, it tries to get more range of motion from the joints above and below, and the spine, the lumbar spine, is right above. So one of the things we know is probably not good for the spine is a lot of loaded lumbar spine flexion. So if I lack the range of motion in my hips and I make my athlete squat deep, I'm going to force them into lumbar spine flexion or rounding, potentially open them up for injuries, right? So for these guys, should we squat below parallel? I don't know. Probably not. I would argue that it's probably not a good thing to do that, right? Modify for them. All right. So when you assess someone, we want to use a systematic assessment, right? So we want to know all the joints and muscles involved in a given movement. So let's use the overhead squat. In the overhead squat, people tend to have trouble with wrist extension, motion, shoulder flexion, range of motion, sometimes external rotation, thoracic spine extension is another important one, having adequate hip flexion, range of motion, having enough knee flexion, generally not too big a deal, and also having ankle dorsiflexion, range of motion. Now, all those joints, we just know the muscles that are involved as well, so we can come up with some sort of intervention for these guys to get them better. But it needs to be systematic like this, because if you have someone who has a limitation in their ability to squat, overhead squat, that could be coming from a hip problem, that could be coming from an ankle problem, right? So we want to check all the joints that are involved and only treat what you find. One of the biggest things that myself and Dave Tilley talk about a lot is that we're trying to be a sniper with our approach. We don't want to hunt with a shotgun, which basically means that if we find that only your left ankle is limited when you're doing when you're doing an overhead squat, you don't need to do hip mobility, shoulder mobility, thoracic spine mobility, right ankle mobility. You need to do just left ankle mobility in order to get better. And that's being a sniper. Being a hunter with a shotgun is the guy that says, okay, let's work on your overhead mobility. Let's look at your thoracic spine. Let's work on your hip mobility. Let's work on your ankles. That's too much, We just ruled out everything is good except for the ankle. We don't need to work on everything else. The other part is that, let's say you make someone mobilize their shoulders, right, when they have an ankle problem, we could be making that shoulder worse. As we said before, sometimes that shoulder is doing more work to make up for the limitation of flexibility in the ankle, and now we're stretching it, right? It's already moving too much, and we're making it move more. Does that sound like a good idea? Probably not, right? So we need a nice systematic approach, right? So as I was saying before, people are going to gripe about this, but if we're truly interested in maximizing safety, and from a rehab perspective, if we want to get people better, we need to make sure we modify all movements, okay, unless we have the prerequisite mobility to perform. Now, this is not always completely black and white, right? So it's like, okay, you're limited overhead motion, but how limited? How bad is it, right? Can you do a specific screen that I've taught people? Like maybe you're close, but you can't quite do it. Should you not press anything overhead? It's hard to say yes or no. But if you have someone who has a very significant limitation, you can pretty safely say, like, you need to modify for a bit until this cleans up a bit. And once it gets better, let's start to introduce it, right? So, a couple modification ideas for you, just to give you an idea of, this is a lot of the stuff that we also talked about in the the modifying workouts course that both Ryan DeBell and myself have created. So if you want to learn more about that, you can definitely check that out. But let's say that your back always rounds in the bottom of a snatch, okay? And this could be because you have a limitation potentially from posterior chain mobility, right? Modification that you could do for these athletes to continue working towards their goals without getting hurt, go from a hang, right? There's no reason why these people can't do the same exact movement a little bit higher so their back stays in a nice safe position, all right? We talked about squat depth before. Let's say you can't squat to depth without the low back rounding. Let's say that someone has ankle mobility restrictions. They also have hip mobility restrictions, right? we can pretty easily get that guy squatting, get that lady squatting. Just go to a box, go a little higher. All right, don't sacrifice lumbar spine position to get your depth. Just go to a specific height and work on getting stronger. Right. Can't get your arms overhead. Let's say your lats are stiff, thoracic spine is stiff. I'd probably stay away from handstands and kipping for a bit. Clean this stuff up before you do that. All right, hammer your mobility before proceeding. Okay. So again, another plug. I apologize, but I think this will really help you out quite a bit. So Dave Tilley and myself, who's another physical therapist, very smart guy, very bright guy. What we did is we saw that, so in CrossFit, there's a lot of very challenging, complex movements, like basically Olympic lifts, handstands, and muscle-ups, and they require very specific mobility. We had the best coaches in the world, so Dave Durante, Chad Vaughn, Mike Service, all the people that coach at Power Monkey Fitness. We took the exact technique that they like, that they use, right? And we just broke down all of those movements, and we figured out which joints can be limited and gave very precise mobilizations that you guys can use to improve movement, right? And we made it into a nice systematic evaluation so you can tell exactly what's limited with people and just be more effective as a coach and more effective as a clinician. So you can find that under the products tab that I have on my site, fitnesspainfree.com. All right, and the last principle I want to talk about is the difference between training and competing, right? This is going to make a little more sense in a minute, but training, in my definition, I just made this up, is actively working towards improving your strength, endurance, skill, technique, in every workout in order to achieve your goals, all right? What I mean by that is that when you're training, you're staying within the heart rate range recommendations. I write a lot of programming, and one of the biggest things we talk about is training certain energy systems. And when you're trying to train a specific energy system as best we can, there's quite a bit of research and guidelines for what our heart rate should be in, right? How hard you're actually supposed to be working to get the training effect that you want, all right? So we don't necessarily want to redline every single workout because we're not getting the training effect that we want, all right? It's very important to try to pick the right workouts so that we're working towards a specific goal from a conditioning perspective, right? The other part is picking the correct weight, right? If the purpose of a conditioning workout you have is to learn how to cycle well through a barbell movement, right? And the weight is too big or too much, a couple things can happen. For one, your technique can fall apart, which is not ideal. And the second part is that you might not be able to cycle the bar. You might have to drop it. You might have to take too much rest. And all of a sudden, the training effect is not the right thing that we want to get. Right? All of a sudden, we're not training the way that we're supposed to get the training effect in order to achieve our goals, right? So you should have kept that weight a little bit lighter. When you're training, you pick the correct weight so you can do the workout the way it's meant to be, all right? The other part is using the right modification. Let's use Fran, right? So Fran, let's say we're using that same athlete that could only do 2 to 3 kipping pull-ups previously. If we want to get a training effect and have that person finish the workout in under 5 minutes, and their 2-3 rep max for kipping pull-ups their best set of kipping pull-ups is 2 to 3, that's not the right training effect. That person is going to be hanging from a pull-up bar staring at it for a long time, right? The workout is going to take too long. So it's very important that we pick the correct modification in that choice in order to get the training effect that we want. And a lot of times this is just basically checking your ego, all right? When you go into the gym every day, check your ego, make sure that you're training in a way that's going to promote progress and decrease your risk of injury, and not just picking a heavier weight to stroke your ego. At the end of the day, it makes no sense, right? All it's going to do to try to use a heavier weight or a harder modification is get you hurt and make you worse. So if you start thinking that way, all of a sudden things make more sense and you're happier and healthier and you're making progress for longer in the gym. Okay? So the opposite of training would be competing. And I'll tell you what, competing is super important. People need to work hard, right? So the definition I came up with competing is doing what you have to do to get doing what you have to do to get the best possible score, weight lifted, time, or to win, right? Whatever that is. So when you compete, a lot of times your technique is compromised. You're trying to blast through these reps. You're trying to get this best possible score. You're going to do what you have to, right? Your energy systems are pushed to the extreme. You're working as hard as you possibly can, right? You're trying to win, right? A lot of times we lose track of how the body feels, right? How about sometimes we're in the gym and we really want to do a workout, but the shoulder's not feeling too good, but you do the workout anyway, and then at the end you're like, oh, my shoulder kind of hurts, right? When you're in the mode of just competing all the time, you lose track of how the body feels, right? We don't modify the way that we should normally, right? We push painful movements we shouldn't to make progress. And I use bunny ears here, quotations, because basically, let's say your knee hurts, right? And you're not good at squatting, right? So this is my problem. I'm not great at squatting, and in years past, I'm like, okay, I need to increase the volume of squatting. I need to do more squatting, get better at squatting, right? And what happened is I got a bit better at squatting, but then I would get really painful to the point where I'd have to really back off of squatting, right? So in my mind, I thought, oh man, I got to push these movements. Doesn't matter how my knee feels. I got to get better, right? What ends up happening is over time, sometimes that pain ends up making you go backwards. And if we want long-term success and we want pain-free fitness, right? Fitnesspainfree.com, we'll plug there. We got to modify it. We have to be smart. We have to listen to our body. And when you're competing, you're not doing that. You're just trying to do as much as you can to win, right? So, again, treating your training like competition on a regular basis can lead to injury, like we just talked about, and also burnout, right? If you're working like a madman every single day, pushing all the Metcon to the extreme, eventually your body's going to say, not so good. I don't like this too much. And we see this a lot in athletes. All right, they get hurt, they don't feel like doing their training anymore, and then their training career is done. Right, their competition career is over. So they're so tired about it. So just to recap, the vast majority of your time in the gym should be training, not competing. All right, and so we're done. Thank you guys for sitting through another webinar. This one is, I'm pretty excited about this stuff. This is really cool information from my perspective. I know a lot of it's really basic common sense, but I feel like this basic common sense is something we need to follow a little bit better. So if you liked it, let me know. If you want me to expand on certain topics, let me know. I can definitely do that. And also, for more information, if you guys want some more knowledge about having how to modify, Coach Brian DeBell and myself, we made the Coach's Guide to Modifying Workouts When Athletes Have Pain. So it's an entire course, basically every modification you'll ever need for painful athletes, both from perspective when someone's in pain, how you can change the movement so they can train without pain, right? And as a therapist or chiropractor, if you have an athlete in pain and you're trying to get them back to competing and training at a high level, how do you systematically do that? All that information's in there. The other one is Monkey Methods, Movement Essentials. That's with Dr. Dave Tilley and myself. I teach you exactly how to assess and correct mobility and technical flaws in the Olympic lifts, muscle ups, and handstands, and that's all based on those super high-level coaches we talked about before. And you can find all these products on the products tab at fitnesspainfree.com. All right, so that's it. Thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you guys next time.